I'm excited to be here today to talk with you about something near and dear to most of us, which is happiness. So indeed, as humans, it seems that we have this yearning or almost insatiable desire to understand happiness. What is it, and how can we become more happy ourselves? This human fascination or absorption with happiness dates back years ago, starting with some of our most sage, kind of ancient scholars. So we see here Aristotle, who said, "Happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence." The Dalai Lama further said that, indeed, even the very motion of our life seems to be headed towards happiness. Freud had his own perspective on happiness. He said, "What we call happiness, in the strictest sense, comes from the satisfaction of needs which have been dammed up to a high degree." So he acknowledges the importance of happiness, but has a particular take on where it might be coming from. And then even in pop culture, we have celebrities like Britney Spears who, when she's on stage, she would claim that she is the happiest person in the world. So we see a wide variety of people, both scholars and those that may be not considered as scholarly, like Britney Spears, really emphasizing how important happiness is to them. But what is happiness really? So this is a course on human emotion, and now that we're nearing the very end of the course, we're getting perhaps to some of the most perplexing and absorbing questions for humankind. What is happiness? How can we become happy? And what differentiates people who are happy from those who are not? So today, we'll be starting our first of 3 modules on happiness and well-being. We'll start with an introduction today, really focusing on the question of what is happiness? Our roadmap today will go as follows. We'll start by looking at this question of what is happiness, followed by trying to probe into what exactly makes us as human beings happy, and then how can we find ways to maximize or attain happiness. Then, of course, we'll conclude with our takeaway questions and expert interview. So, what is happiness exactly, right? So when we think about what happiness is, there's different perspectives that we can approach this question from. I'll start here with what's usually referred to as the scientific definition in the field of psychological science. So how have psychology researchers tried to answer this question of what is happiness? So from their perspective, they would say happiness is a broad umbrella, and under this umbrella of happiness, there's at least 3 main parts. So the 3 parts of happiness, according to many psychology researchers, would be as follows. The first part would be high positive affect. So in other words, experiencing intense and frequent positive emotions. Part 2, not surprisingly, would be low negative affect. So by contrast, experiencing low level and infrequent negative emotions. And the third part that kind of brings this all together is subjective well-being, or what people also call life satisfaction. So this is a broader view on one's life. So cognitively evaluating one's current and past circumstances and really thinking about, on a whole, to what extent do you feel like you're satisfied with your life and have a sense of well-being. So each of these 3 parts or components of happiness represents what you could think of as an important building block of what makes happiness what we think of today, right? So these first 2 components, high positive affect and low negative affect, are considered the more emotional or hedonic components, whereas this third component down here, subjective well-being, we can think of it more as a cognitive evaluation of one's life as a whole. Okay, so we have 3 parts of happiness according to a scientific perspective. Another important insight on happiness is the function of these kinds of feeling states. So Barbara Fredrickson, who's a very famous researcher pioneering the field of positive emotion, would say that positive emotions, so feeling states related to happiness, serve important functions for us insofar as what she would say they broaden and build. And what she means by this is the following. So she would say positive emotions like joy, love, contentment, interest, and happiness, they serve to broaden, so they expand our inventory of thoughts and actions. They widen our attentional scope to take in new information. In addition to broadening what she calls our thought-action repertoires, they also build. But by build, she means that they help us really develop important resources for our life. So positive emotions help build physical, mental, and social resources. Importantly, we know that positive emotions serve important broadening and building functions, But what we need to keep in mind is that not all positive emotions are alike. So you can think of this umbrella of happiness or positive feelings as having a variety of different flavors, right? Almost like you could think of a rainbow having different spectrums of colors. So what are the different colors of positive feelings or happiness-related states? So research by Dr. Keltner and colleagues at UC Berkeley would say there are potentially an unlimited number of positive states, but ones that we've gained a lot of important insights to and really shown that they're functionally distinct and that they feel different for us are as follows. So we have these high arousal, approach-oriented states of excitement. These are the things that, get us really revved up and push us towards, some goal or some, reward in the environment. This is related to feelings like joy, right? So feeling pleasantly surprised or, responding to something good that's happening in the environment around you. So excitement and joy are both high arousal positive states. This is very distinct, though, from the emotion of compassion. So this is a more other-oriented, pro-social emotion. This is signaled when we see other people in distress or in vulnerable situations, and it motivates us to sort of get up and go help them. So it's a very what they call pro-social, other-oriented positive emotion. Then we have love. So this is thought to be originated from our early attachment systems that Bowlby and colleagues have written about. And this connects us to other people, in terms of monogamous pair bonds as well as attachment between a caregiver and an offspring. And then finally we have pride that we've talked about earlier in this course, which is a very self-focused emotion, so feeling a heightened esteem about one's accomplishments. And this is thought to help an individual, one, know their place within a social hierarchy, and also advertise their elevated social status to others following a major accomplishment. So what we want to see here is that there's a whole distinct array of positive feelings. Now, a different perspective from the one I just showed you in contemporary psychology is a perspective that many people think of as hedonism. So under this perspective, it's really thought to be that pleasure is the only intrinsic good, and that the goal of our lives from this perspective is to try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. So if we look here, what we see is the following quote, which I think really captures the essence of the hedonistic perspective. It says, "Pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and every aversion, and to it we always come back, inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which to judge of every good thing." So this perspective really suggests that what happiness is something that consists of two things: seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, really, when we think of hedonism, we have to ask ourselves, is happiness really about pursuing pleasure? Or in other words, is it the sum of our different types of sensory pleasures, from physical pleasures to substances, to even just, an everyday coffee? Is that really what constitutes happiness, this sort of everlasting pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain? Let's take a different perspective. So this is our third perspective on happiness, and this is one that's really grounded in early philosophical writings, and this is the sort of perspective often referred to as eudaimonia. So what is eudaimonia? So again, if we return to Aristotle, who we saw at the beginning of our class today, remember he said happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. So eudaimonia isn't about simple sensory pleasures. It's about something bigger than the self, perhaps, or this idea of flourishing. So Aristotle and others would say what happiness really is are the following four components. So eudaimonia involves focusing on the highest human good. It's about living a good life, or what he called virtuous activity. And really, instead of focusing on immediate sources of pleasure, coffee or food or drugs, this is about longer-term life satisfaction. And in essence, not surprisingly, coming from a philosophical perspective, eudaimonia should involve some kind of deep contemplation of life, as he would say, in accordance with reason. So this is really about a bigger sense of having a good life, feeling satisfied, and deeply contemplating almost the meaning of your life as well. So this is what this perspective would suggest truly is the essence of happiness. And then in more recent writings from psychologists, there's been this notion that Marty Seligman from Penn has brought up, which is this idea of authentic happiness. And he would say, authentic happiness consists of a few key ingredients: he would say it's the following. So as you're seeing a theme here, many people talk about happiness, and they don't define it in terms of just one core component. They're often breaking it apart into different subcomponents, and this is a constant theme we see in the field of happiness. So he would say there's 3 roots to happiness. First, there's the pleasant life, so attaining and maximizing pleasures. In many ways, this is similar to a hedonistic perspective. Second is a good life, knowing what he'd call your signature strengths, your own unique strengths and capacities, and using this to help cultivate friendship, leisure, and in other words, increase your experience of flow. And then there's the meaningful life. So again, using your own signature strengths in service of something larger than the self. So this is the notion of authentic happiness. If you'd like to read more about it, here's a book by Marty Seligman that you can delve into. Okay, so we've gone through different perspectives of what is happiness, and as you'll see, there's no agreement on just one definition of what happiness is. Instead, there's different perspectives that take different angles trying to tackle this perplexing and everlasting human question. So we have a sense of what different people think about what happiness is, but how much do we know about what actually makes us happy? And how good are we at actually predicting the kinds of things that are going to make us happy? So let's move to our second step on the roadmap. What actually makes us happy? And do we have any clue about this at all? So what makes us happy? This is a bit of a mystery, and this is something people have struggled to understand for centuries, and even now, with the ever-increasing, pop culture emphasis on trying to find ways to become happy, is something we still struggle with and are just very eager to try to better understand. So let's look at a little bit of the evidence of what we know predicts happiness. So in this very exciting discipline, people have looked at a variety of factors of what are the true predictors of happiness. I'm going to walk you through just 6 of them today and show you some of the findings that have come out when people have really tried to look at, is it money, is it education, is it gender? What are the things that truly predict increased levels of happiness as we seek to find it, in our never-ending quest towards happiness. So let's start with education level. So what does research have to say? Is being, quote, smarter actually something that makes you happier? Well, what research can say at this point is that the more educated you are, so the greater number of years you've been, in high school and college and beyond, this is associated with increased self-reports of happiness. Now, this doesn't mean being smarter makes you happier, but it does suggest that those people who pursue longer-term education generally report feeling happier than those who don't. Okay. What about gender? Are men and women different in how happy they are? And if so, which gender is more or less happy than the other? Well, here, this is really interesting. So Myers pooled data from over 170,000 interviews across 16 nations over a 6-year period. The upshot that you can see here is when they looked at how men and women reported, what percent of men and women reported how satisfied they were versus how happy they were. By and large, we see no gender differences in self-reported happiness. So women are not happier than men. Men don't seem to be significantly happier than women. Okay, what about age? So as we grow older, do we grow happier or do we grow more miserable? And likewise, is youth really the secret of happiness? So here, this is work done by Laura Carstensen at Stanford and colleagues, and one way they tried to answer this question, happier and wiser, is they looked at older compared to younger adults in their everyday life. So they took them, out of the lab using something like a Palm Pilot here and had them self-report their own positive and negative emotion 5 times a day for approximately a 1-week period. Then they followed these individuals up 5 years later and again 10 years later. And their analyses suggested, looking both cross-sectionally and using sophisticated growth curve modeling techniques, this indicates that aging was indeed associated with a more positive overall emotional well-being profile. And you can see this here. So if you look at positive emotion experience here on the left, going up and increasing, and age here on the bottom increasing from 20 all the way up to 90, what you're seeing is that indeed people's self-reported experience of positive feelings related to happiness generally increases as they get older. This is something we talked about earlier in our course, looking at development of emotion and aging. And if you're interested in learning more about this fascinating work, I highly recommend you watch this talk by Laura Carstensen, where she argues that older people indeed are happier. So this is a TED Talk by Laura Carstensen that you can find at the link here below. Okay, what about money? So can money really buy happiness? So what we find here is that, in lower socioeconomic cultures, money really can be a big predictor of happiness, as it can mean the difference between getting basic needs met in terms of medical attention, food, and shelter or not. However, if you're in a middle socioeconomic class or above, money seems to have a very weak relationship with happiness from that point forward. So this is a study that was done by Dan Kahneman and colleagues, and this confirms this finding. So they say that the belief that high income is associated with good mood is widespread but mostly illusory. People with above average income are relatively satisfied with their lives, but are barely happier than others in moment-to-moment experience. They tend to be more tense and do not spend more time in particularly enjoyable activities. Moreover, the effect of income on life satisfaction seems to be transient. So we argue that people exaggerate the contribution of income to happiness because they focus in part on conventional achievements when evaluating their life or the lives of others. So this kind of work suggests truly that money doesn't buy happiness beyond, fulfilling basic needs of food and shelter. And that in fact our belief that, earning more money is going to make us happier is largely illusory, they would argue. And so here you can see a table from their paper that indeed suggests, if you look at the percentage of people who are very happy, for example, at the bottom here, you see, an increase, from individuals who are earning under $20,000 a year to those earning between $20,000 and about $50,000 a year. But then once you hit $50,000 and above, it really doesn't seem to dramatically change. So we're not seeing the percent of people who are very happy increase above and beyond, achieving what is thought to be a middle-class income level. So, can money buy happiness? Well, research would suggest no based on these findings. Yet, some really interesting work that came out recently suggests, well, money can buy happiness when it's spent the right way. So research by Liz Dunn and Laura Aknin and Michael Norton suggests that when you spend money on other people, then it significantly predicts greater happiness. So as you can see here, they would say, although much research has examined the effect of income on happiness, we suggest that how people spend their money may be at least as important as how much money they earn. And here they find in their research that when people actually spend money on other people, that this significantly predicts greater happiness. If you're interested in learning more about this, both Mike Norton and Liz Dunn have recently published a book called Happy Money, The Science of Smarter Spending. And here they suggest that why you can get more happiness for your money is by following what they call 5 principles. One of the core principles is spending money on other people versus buying things for yourself. So, it seems that money itself doesn't buy happiness when we think of it in terms of just raw income level, but how we spend money may actually significantly contribute to how happy we are when we're in part spending it on other people. Now, what about political ideology? Does being conservative versus more liberal actually influence how happy you are? So this is work done by my colleague here at Yale University, Jamie Napier, where she found that conservatives actually report being significantly happier than liberals. So she found that both within and outside of the United States, that more right-wing political orientation was associated with greater self-reported well-being and happiness. And this is a really interesting and controversial finding, looking at the question of why are conservatives happier than liberals? And she and her colleague argue that one possible account of this finding is a phenomenon they call system justification, whereby more right-wing oriented individuals tend to what they would say rationalize or justify the status quo of a given society, whereas more liberal or left-wing oriented individuals tend to become actually more upset by certain social inequalities, thus decreasing their level of happiness. So if you're interested in reading more about precisely why conservatives are happier than liberals because they tend to sort of justify the status quo, I highly recommend checking out this article, Why Are Conservatives Happier Than Liberals? And here you can see that they talk a little bit about the idea that there's different ideological differences between conservatives and liberals and how they respond to social inequalities and how that drives their current degree of happiness. Okay. Now we're going to end with the idea of relationships. So Aristotle said, long ago, man is by nature a social animal. So we are deeply attached to other people. And in fact, a big part of what we do in our lives is seek out relationships and activities that are going to bring us closer to others. So, to what extent was Aristotle right in saying we're a social animal and saying that's what is a, predictor of our happiness? So indeed, what seems to make us happy is the esteem and respect of others. And we're most happy when we have family and friends, as you can see in these pictures. And it seems that everything else we think will make us happy really are just ways of building more family and more friends. So what research has found is that the biggest predictor by and large of happiness is not money, not age, not gender, not political ideology, but your degree of intimacy with others, your social relationships, your social support network. So then if we think of all these factors, then what do happy people look like? So this was a study looking at characteristics of people who reported themselves as, being very happy. And this is work done by Ed Diener and Marty Seligman. They wanted to know what are the psychological correlates of what they called very happy people. And here they looked at a sample of over 200 undergraduates, and they looked at people who were in the upper 10% of rating themselves as consistently very happy people. So what were the characteristics of these very happy people? Well, the things that they did have was a higher sense of self-esteem, more optimism. They tended to be more extroverted and agreeable when it came to personality traits. And as we said, with social relationships being the greatest predictor of happiness, very happy people reported having good social relations. The ways in which they didn't differ is very happy people don't exercise more, they don't engage more in religious practices, and they actually don't have a greater frequency of positive life events. So if you think about it, the things that seem to be really strongly associated with very happy people tend to be sort of cognitive orientations about themselves, the future, and general tendencies like extroversion and agreeableness that help them sort of get along and navigate the social world smoothly. And to what extent are people born happy? So there's this idea of a happiness set point. So we know that, interestingly, about 40 to 50% of the answer of our own degree of happiness lies in genetics. So we're born with what some people would argue is a genetically determined happiness set point, meaning that even though our happiness will seesaw following pleasure or traumatic life events, it often shifts back to a natural level. But this doesn't mean that all of our happiness is somehow genetically predetermined. And in fact, the other half of the pie here are life circumstances and intentional activities that you yourself choose to do in order to increase or decrease your happiness. So now I want to move on to how do we find happiness. Given we've talked about what is happiness, the things that make us happy, how do we then go about trying to maximize our own happiness here and now? So as you can see, this is something that's very important to many people, especially in westernized societies. So there's an increasing not only scientific focus on happiness, as we've talked about today, but also a flooding of pop culture attention and books focused on finding ways to maximize and attain everlasting happiness, as you can see here. We also see this evident in our pharmaceutical industry with, sales for a host of antidepressants skyrocketing in prescription rates, including Prozac, Paxil, Cymbalta. There seems to be this emphasis on finding ways to decrease distress and maximize feelings of positivity or happiness. So I'm going to go through just a few quick questions here on what makes us happy. The first question is a really important one. It asks, to what extent do we know what will make us happy? Or in other words, can we predict what will make us happy in the first place? So this is work done by Dan Gilbert at Harvard University, and he's really put forth this idea of what he calls affective forecasting. So affective forecasting is the prediction of one's emotional state in the future. And he has found that most of the time, people are wrong about how they think they're going to feel. We think things will often matter more than they do. And when it comes to predicting our own happiness, we often look forward into the future and predict that good things like maybe a promotion at work or having a really good piece of cake, that it's going to make us feel really happy and for a very long time. And we're actually wrong. So we tend to overestimate how positive, how happy things in the future are going to make us feel. So we're not very good at predicting what's going to make us happy and how long it's going to make us feel happy for. And to some extent, this might cause worry, that we're sort of wearing these rosy-colored glasses when we look into our horizon. But he would argue that actually this positive bias about our future is an important part of what makes us human. It helps us get to a present state that helps us remain positive about the future and motivate us to pursue goals. But indeed, we're not good at predicting what will make us happy. And he talks more about this in his TED Talk, titled The Surprising Science of Happiness, that you can check out here at the link below. Second question, can we stay happy once we actually find it? So once we get a glimpse of it and hold it in our palms, can we keep it there? And this is work that's talked about under the concept of the hedonic treadmill. So we know as humans that we're really good at adapting to new circumstances. We rapidly habituate to changes in our current situation. This tendency of humans, however, to adapt also means that we quickly return to a relatively stable level of happiness, despite very positive events like winning the lottery or very negative events like a divorce. So thus, even when very positive or very negative things happen, our happiness seems to stay at a relatively constant rate. So people liken the pursuit of increasing happiness to running on a treadmill. It's almost like we're working just to stay at the same place, right? So as good as we are at adapting to new circumstances, it often means that, the more we try to pursue happiness and something really great happens, or even when we fail and really negative life events happen, we seem to relatively stay at the same place. And so if we're struggling to become happier and happier, it's almost that we're running against an ever-moving treadmill. And finally, can we find happiness? So it seems that we're not good at predicting our happiness. We seem to sort of stay at a relatively constant rate, but yet we all believe that we have the right to pursue happiness. So ingrained in all of us, even you can see here in the Declaration of Independence, is the notion of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So this is a notion that we all hold incredibly important. But should we even be striving to attain happiness in the first place? So in illuminating work done by Iris Mouse and colleagues, she suggests not. So her work has found that people who endorse highly valuing happiness and put a lot of effort into striving to attain it unknowingly set up high standards for happiness, right? They sort of set their threshold bar very high for what ought to be an acceptable level of happiness. And as a result, when you set high standards, you often are likely to experience disappointment when these happiness standards aren't met. And this finding is most apparent in positive situations, like watching a happy film, for example, where you might most desire to feel happy. So they call this the paradoxical pursuit of happiness, because the more we value happiness, it seems the less happiness we actually experience, that we almost set ourselves up to live less happy lives the more valiantly we try to become happy. So it seems in many ways that John Stuart Mill was right. He said, "Those only are happy who have their minds fixed on some object other than their own happiness." So the harder we look for happiness, the less likely we're able to find it. So in many ways, this suggests we ought to try less to find happiness and let it flow naturally. So with this, I'd like to segue now to our takeaway questions. The takeaway questions for today are as follows. First, what is happiness, and how has it been defined from the different scientific, historical, and philosophical perspectives discussed today? Second, what are the significant predictors of happiness, and how are very happy people unique? What characteristics do and don't define them? And finally, what is this paradoxical pursuit of happiness we just spoke about? Does this suggest that we should strive to be happy, or should we let go of this relentless pursuit to become happier people? And now we'll turn to our expert interview. So this is part of our Experts in Emotion interview series. Today, for our Experts in Emotion interview, we'll be speaking with Dr. Barbara Fredrickson on positive emotion. So Dr. Fredrickson is a distinguished professor of psychology and director of the Positive Emotions and Psychophysiology Lab at the University of North Carolina. She's a leading scholar studying positive emotions and human flourishing, and her research on positive emotions and lifestyle change is funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health. Dr. Fredrickson has published more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and with the publication of Positivity in 2009 and Love 2.0 in 2013, she's written about her research for general audiences as well. Dr. Fredrickson's contributions have been recognized with numerous honors, including the American Psychological Association's Templeton Prize in Positive Psychology and the Society of Experimental Psychology's Career Trajectory Award. Her work has been influenced scholars and practitioners worldwide within education, business, healthcare, the military, and beyond. And as a result, she's regularly invited to give keynotes nationally and internationally. So I now turn to a very special Experts in Emotion interview together with Dr. Barbara Fredrickson from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.